So last week in our small group, Kathy actually said something that was pretty tough to disagree with. She said, "The Bible is so violent. It's probably the most violent book I have ever read." And of course, as she said this, I was already working on this week's passage, Judges 19 through 21, which have to be some of the most disturbing and most violent passages in all of Scripture. Right? At the very center of this passage, what we read earlier together, is a civil war. All of the tribes of Israel joined together to go to war with a single tribe, the tribe of Benjamin, one of their own. And you might remember at the end of Joshua, just a few weeks ago, the tribes of Israel actually came together at the end of Joshua and almost went to war with themselves there too. But here it actually happens, and the war is brutal. By the end, tens of thousands of men are killed. The entire tribe of Benjamin is utterly wiped out. Women and children, except for 600 men. War is always brutal. But civil wars have an especially devastating effect on people, right? To fight against your neighbors, to fight against your own family, for the Israelites to fight against their brothers and sisters who shared their God and shared their inheritance. For the Israelites to divide and war against their own was not only brutal, but it was utterly devastating. It meant that what God had brought together, they were tearing apart. It's all the more devastating that warring against each other is the only thing in Joshua and Judges capable of unifying Israel. Both at the end of Joshua and then here at the end of Judges, it is only the possibility of going to war against their own that unites them. And we've seen what war does. War throughout Joshua and now also Judges. War is both caused by and is the cause of worse violence. Specifically, as we experienced this morning in our passage, it's women who face the worst of it. You heard a summary of what happened. The reading that we heard earlier jumps into the middle of the story. I did that in part on purpose because we had kids among us. But you heard in it a summary of what came before. The Levite briefly tells the story of what happened to his concubine. And so in chapter 20, verse 5, we heard him say, "And the leaders of Gibeah rose against me and surrounded the house against me by night. They meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine, and she is dead." But it's worth hearing the story in its entirety, paying close attention to who this concubine is and what happens to her. And we need to hear her story. We need to hear her story and understand her place in the world that she lives in so that we can make sense of what follows after Israel's civil war. Because after Israel's civil war, there are only 600 men from the tribe of Benjamin left. The rest of the Israelites, seeing this, are moved with compassion. They realize that they've almost entirely wiped out a group of people that belong to them, and they stop and they sort of freak out, and then they say, "We have to do something," and they create a strategy to restore the tribe of Benjamin. And this strategy involves two distinct events that are only understood in light of what happens to the Levite's concubine. First, the Israelites decide to wipe out an entire town for revenge. That town didn't come and help fight earlier when the people gathered against Benjamin. And so they've decided men, women, children, everyone, except the virgin women, were to be destroyed. These women were to be given to the men of Benjamin in order for them to then be able to have children and restore their tribe. But turns out when they finished the massacre, there are only 400 virgin women. Not enough. Bummer. And so they develop a second plan. But the second plan had to be clever, because when everyone was still angry with Benjamin, when everybody had come against Benjamin in their anger, every tribe together had decided to make a collective vow: none of us will give our daughters in marriage to Benjamin. And of course, since a vow is the most important thing that anyone can make, of course it's not, but at least in their eyes, they are convinced that it is. They realize they have to find a way around this vow. And they know, okay, so there's this festival, this annual festival that happens where a number of young women come out and they dance in the vineyards as part of this celebration to the Lord. And so the leaders of Israel put in motion a plan to steal 200 women from this festival, from this celebration. And they think, when the leaders of that tribe, when they come to us and they complain that their women have been stolen, we'll just tell them to take one for the team. They won't be guilty for having broken the vow that we all made together, because they didn't give them willingly, we took them. And they will have helped restore the tribe of Benjamin. They've done their good Israelite duty. This is terrible. It has to be pointed out that these 600 fellow Israelite women are going to be from plan A and plan B, are going to be taken from their families. They're going to be taken from their land, and they will have taken from them any sort of autonomy. They are treated as nothing more than plunder from war. When Kathy says that this is the most violent book she has read, she's not wrong. As you read it, some of the details might not be spelled out in the kind of detail. It doesn't appear quite as violent as maybe some of our favorite movies or shows, but the reality is this is utterly brutal for the women who are taken. And the danger for us as readers of this story is the same danger that's faced Bible readers through the centuries. The danger is that we would interpret this badly. There is nothing in this text at all that would suggest that God has instructed this, let alone that God condones this or wants this. One of the worst things that we can do when we interpret the Bible is to assume that God wants something to happen just because it happens. We have to interpret the story as we're instructed by the text itself to interpret it. On either end of the story, we are taught how to read this. This is what happens when Israel has no king. This is what happens when everyone does what is right in their own eyes. This is chaos. It is anarchy. It is complete rebellion against God and his ways. The book of Genesis opens the Bible. And when it opens, we discover pretty quickly that violence is part of what undoes God's good creation. But early on, it's violence that brothers do to brothers when they're given freedom that destroys God's creation. In Genesis, we also then learn that when violence goes unquestioned, violence increases. And then in Genesis, we're told that the cause of the great flood was the utter devastation caused by human violence. Genesis opens up the Bible by orienting us to human violence as a plague on the earth. Even after essentially starting over with the flood, God teaches us that violence cannot be destroyed with more violence. I mean, how much more violent can you get than utterly wiping out the entire earth, except for a couple few remaining who are righteous? Violence cannot eradicate the earth of violence. Violence lives in the human heart. It's nurtured there. It takes on life there. And it is what Jesus said. You may not have murdered somebody, but if you hate someone in your heart, the seeds of violence have already been planted. Judges will end with young Israelite women being forcibly taken and raped by their own people. It shouldn't surprise us because this is just an escalation of what was already taking place. And so we look at the story of the Levite and his concubine, and we take a closer look at what happens to her to see what follows as merely the same old thing, but expanded and enhanced in scope and in devastation. So chapter 19, verse 10. The story picks up. The Levite is being persuaded by the concubine's father to stay another night in his home. But the Levite has already been delayed for several times, and he just wants to get on the road. And so in verse 10 we read, "But the man would not spend the night. He rose up and departed and arrived opposite Jebus," that is Jerusalem. "He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. When they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, 'Come now, let us turn aside to the city of the Jebusites, and let's spend the night in it.' And his master said to him, 'We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners, who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah.'" So you'll notice that there's a comparison being created, a comparison between Israelite and foreign cities. Here they are, just miles apart geographically, closer than Livermore and Pleasanton. And the Levite has a sense that these cities should be radically different from each other. So different that the Levite would risk traveling at night when it is far more dangerous to travel just to get to the security of an Israelite city. And he said to this young man, "Come and let us draw near to one of those places and spend the night at Gibeah or Ramah." So they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to the tribe of Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. The Levite, having passed by the foreign city of Jebus, he assumed, right, he would find better treatment in a city of his own people. And here he sits down defeated, because no one extended to him the hospitality that he had expected to find. The Levite assumed that Gibeah would be different from Jebus because Israelite cities were supposed to be marked by God's hospitality. A radical kind of hospitality in the ancient world. Hospitality that wasn't just extended to their own people, to fellow Israelites, but to foreign travelers. He was sure that he would find someone to bring him in, and he can't find it in his own homeland. So we keep reading at verse 16. "And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, which is just to the north, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. The men of the place were Benjaminites. And the old man lifted up his eyes, and he saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, 'Where are you going? Where did you come from?' And the Levite said to him, 'We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I'm going to the house of the Lord, but no one has taken me into their house. We have straw and feed for our own donkeys, with bread and wine for me, and for your female servant and the young man with your servants, there is no lack of anything.'" And so you can hear it again. no one has taken me into his house. He is judging the lack of hospitality shown to him by these people, by this town. But it's also important to notice that the old man is from the same place as the Levite. And so in the midst of the strangeness of the there's not an L in there. I don't know where that one came from. Benjaminites, there we go. There is a shared connection that they discover, right? They're from the same place. And there's a camaraderie immediately sort of established. But the Levite isn't alone. And he doesn't want to presume on the man and his resources. So he assures the old man that he has his own sufficient means, not only for himself, but even for some of this man's needs. He won't be a burden on this man if he would bring them into their home. And in verse 20, we read, the old man said, "Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square." And so we brought him into his house and gave the donkeys feed. And they washed their feet and ate and drank. Something strange is happening here. And this is one of those awkward places where English is just lacking in some of the basic grammar that other languages have that would make this much clearer. See, the Levite is not alone. He's not traveling alone. He has his concubine with him, and he also has at least one other servant. But the man is unconcerned with either of them, as is clear in his language. See, the old man speaks of peace, but he speaks of peace in the singular form. Speaks of peace to you and an individual, as opposed to you as two or you as many, which exists in the Hebrew and in many other languages. So this offer of peace that the old man gives is only to the Levite, this fellow countryman. And the old man speaks of caring for your wants, but again, he's speaking only of the wants of the Levite. And it's the Levite that the man does not want to stay in the square. Stay, you individually, or do not stay, you individually in the square tonight. And so the old man then brings, and this actually shows up in your English text, brings him into his house, and he fed the donkeys. There have been hints along the way that the man's concubine was questionable status. But here the case begins to grow stronger. And it's probably a good point to say something about concubines, since this is a fairly foreign idea for us, right? Generally, a concubine was considered a secondary sort of wife, but without any of the rights, privileges, or protections that were given to a wife in God's instructions. So if you had a concubine, it could be that you already had a wife. Or, and this seems to be the case here, you could have a concubine without having a wife. And there were advantages to having a concubine. And so to explain it like this, God's law governed the way that a man and woman entered into marriage. God's law had specific instructions about the way that a man and woman were to live in marriage together. And God's law gave specific instructions about how a man and a woman could part ways, ending a marriage. God's instructions involving marriage were almost entirely about protecting women in a world that was hostile to women. And thus the advantage of having a concubine, if you were a man. God's law has nothing to say about concubines. And so you could literally do anything you wanted to a concubine that you were allowed to do to a servant or a slave, to your possessions. Owning a concubine was a clever way of avoiding your marriage responsibilities under God's law. Talk about a low commitment, low cost arrangement that is highly advantageous for any man in a patriarchal context. On top of that, the argument goes, you could actually avoid being guilty of adultery because you were having sex with property and not a person. Consider the the mental gymnastics that need to be done to make that one work, but this is the way that they made sense of it. As crazy as it all sounds today, even today, people continue to find creative ways to work around God's instructions on marriage and sexuality. In our day, in our context, living together before marriage has really become the new low-cost, low-commitment way of testing out whether marriage is for you and finding out whether the chemistry is there, that you've chosen the right person. This is a convenient way of avoiding the heavy cost of marriage, heavy commitment of marriage. Being friends with benefits is an even lower cost and even lower commitment way of getting what you want. Pornography, more and more, is seen as completely harmless because there apparently is no emotional cost to be paid. And culturally, it has become accepted as normal and is really not seen as being somehow unfaithful to one's marriage vows. And so in some ways, pornography is actually the closest to the practice of owning a concubine, right? Because in the same way that having sex with a concubine was explained away as not real because the person was a slave, they were a possession, they weren't really a person, well, pornography endures the same rationalizations, right? And pornography represents the same power that exists between a master and his concubine, where a person has complete control. The other exists to serve and please you with no cost and no commitment. I draw these loose connections only so that we are not too quick to dismiss the idea that a concubine is so completely ancient and foreign that it's still somehow irrelevant to us. Right? The ideas behind what a concubine was, and more specifically, who a concubine was, they continue to live on in new forms for us today. A concubine was property to be used, not a person to be known and loved. It was right in their own eyes to see a woman in this way. And our passage suggests that this is exactly how our Levite saw her. At the beginning of chapter 19, we're introduced to a certain Levite who took for himself a concubine. You take possessions. You know a wife. And then as she leaves her father's home, the concubine is listed as just one more thing the Levite takes on his journey after his donkey's saddled with all of his belongings. And here too, by the old man, she is neither addressed nor even spoken of. She, like the other servant, is merely part of the Levite's property. And so we keep reading in verse 22. As they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house that we may know him. Not sure if I have to mention this, but this is a euphemism. They want to have sex with the Levite. And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, no, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Violate them and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing. And we are immediately struck how outrageous the old man's request is. It is outrageous that the old man sees the Levite's life as more valuable than the concubine or his own daughter. It is outrageous that the old man would consider an attack on the Levite vile, but the same attack on his daughter and concubine as necessary or acceptable or better. It is outrageous That this man and the Levite, people in possession of God's wisdom, instruction, have no moral compass. Or their moral compass is broken irreparably. But the old man reveals how such an outrageous system could ever develop that would turn women into property. It's not that the men don't value concubines because they're concubines. It's that the men don't value their own daughters enough to resist and dismantle a system that continues to devalue them. The men of this context do not value women as human beings, made equally and beautifully in the image of God. When the Israelites go and they take 200 daughters of Shiloh to be given to the tribe of Benjamin, it's not like they're doing something inconsistent with who the Israelites are. It seems right in the eyes of one man to give his daughter away for the sake of preserving the life of another man. Why wouldn't the Israelites as a whole accept the same, just scaled up? What's 200 women except for 200 wives? This point continues to be made in verse 25. But the men outside would not listen to him. So the men seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where his master was until the light. And her master rose up in the morning, and when he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let's be going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. Even in her death, she is not treated like a human being, deserving of the dignity of even a proper burial. In life, she was an object to be used by her master for his pleasure. And in death, she was an object to be used to rally the tribes against the Levites' enemies. Outrageously, the Levite is not upset about what happened to his concubine until he discovers she has died, because it is in her death that the Levite has now been wronged. His property no longer has value for him. The men of Gibeah have robbed him of his concubine. Can you imagine a more violent story? Could any story reveal the truth of Kathy's words any more than this? I mean, if you struggle with the violence in the Bible, you are not alone. But you also have to know that the Bible has to speak about violence, because the Bible is committed to revealing the truth. Just yesterday morning, I came across an article about in a newspaper about violence against women taking place all over the world. The article was specifically about these two young female tourists who were murdered. But it also included mention of an American journalist who was assaulted in broad daylight walking down the street by herself. The article then highlighted some of the dehumanizing ways that men publicly address and call out to women on city streets, whether it's in New York or other major centers in the world. And it talked about the way that men often talk to women, especially famous women online, often threatening to rape or kill them, whether it's on Twitter or in comment sections of articles written by women. This is fairly common. When the Bible depicts horrific violence, most of the time it is attempting to hold up a mirror to say, this is what lives in our hearts. We are capable of this sort of violence if we will allow it to take root and to grow and to become something in us. And Judges 19 through 21 urges us to see that nobody starts out this violent. We start somewhere much less threatening. We start out by trying to find ways just to get what we want, to satisfy ourselves, to get some sort of power in this life. And this then becomes or requires us to begin looking at people as a means to get what we want. It requires us to begin looking at people as objects or things, something less than fully human. The moment we begin to use other people to get what we want, we find ourselves on this journey. When we look at others and we decide that we have to hate them, we decide that we have to treat them like objects, we have to disregard them, we have to look at what they face and shrug our shoulders and say, well, they must have deserved it. In all of these instances, we've stripped from people their humanity, their dignity, the image of God that lives in them. And in all of these responses, we discover that we are seeing them not the way that God sees them, but according to what is right in our own eyes. And these are the ways that we respond when we don't have a king who's showing us a better way to see. This is Palm Sunday. And there is a tension that exists in Palm Sunday. The incredible celebration of the day when Jesus enters Jerusalem, declaring himself the king of a kingless people. The people that God comes to are desperately in need of the king who is capable of showing them how things really are. He entered to make perfectly clear that God's kingdom is never built on the backs of or with the lives of whoever we might categorize as weak or vulnerable or marginalized. Women have often been categorized in these ways. But Genesis, the same Genesis that reveals to us that violence is in our hearts and that violence destroys God's good creation, this Genesis tells us, you know who women are? Women with men reveal God's character and nature to the world. That men and women were created side by side as co-equal partners in this good creation. It's only when they have this equal status that God looks at them and says, this is very good. And so it shouldn't surprise us at all that when Jesus shows up, that women are disciples. They follow Jesus. They learn from Jesus. They learn at his feet. Women funded his mission. They traveled with them, and we're told in the Gospels that they were some of the ones who helped make it possible for his mission to continue to move forward. In the New Testament letters, we discover that there are women who are continuing to fund Paul and his work. But on top of all of this, for whatever reason, well, I have some guesses as to the reason. God chose. He had 12 disciples who were men. We know that there were other disciples who were women. He chose to make women the first preachers of the gospel. On that resurrection morning, when Jesus was no longer bound by the tomb, when God had raised him from the dead, women are the first to go and proclaim that he is risen. This by God's choice, this by the king's direction. That in the kingdom of God, women do not get to have second place citizenship. This is good news. Deborah and Jael are part of the story of Judges, places where God is suggesting this is true, that women are capable and that they are strong and that they are worthy of equal standing among God's people. One of the tragedies of the church has been that as we who follow Jesus and bear his good news, the church has been known for continuing really terrible ideas and really terrible views of where women belong in the kingdom. Of course, this isn't just about where women belong in the kingdom. It's about anybody who we would ascribe second-class citizenship to. But our passage this morning specifically deals with the people of God and their relationship with women. The other thing that this passage leads us to wrestle with is that the Israelites are using power in the same way that everybody else uses power to get what they want, whatever that is. And if they have to hurt somebody or kill somebody, so be it. But on Palm Sunday, the day when Jesus entered into Jerusalem, declared the king not only of Israel, but of the entire world. Philippians 2 captures it best when it says, Jesus, who being equal with God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptying himself, he became a servant. Jesus shows us what a true king does, what true strength is, what true power is. It's not taking the vulnerable and sacrificing them in your place so that you might continue to have life. It's laying down your life. Jesus says, not just for your friends, even the pagans do that, but for your enemies. To what extent do we find ourselves willing to lay down our lives for those that we not only consider sort of subhuman, less important than us? This is especially relevant for us as Americans because Americans tend to see themselves as better than the rest of the world. Anybody that we would be tempted to see as not as good as us, Jesus invites us to lay down our lives for them, to offer our lives as a sacrifice for them. Judges is so terrible. Can we just be honest about that? And what a perfect way to approach Holy Week. To recognize how deeply we need to have our vision of this world transformed. How deeply we need to see the world through the lens of the kingdom of God. How deeply we need to have our minds transformed and our hearts transformed and our lives transformed so that the kingdom of God can begin to be seen in and through us, in the ways that we live with one another, the ways that we love one another, the ways that we offer our lives for the sake of not just the people we love, but for our enemies. And so we come to the table this morning to remember the one who did not consider his divinity something to be used against us, but laid it down and took our very worst, our violence, upon himself so that he could demonstrate that our violence is so empty that if you try to use your violence against a God who raises the dead, you should just give up now. It's worthless. This is what we come to the table this morning to remember. Jesus laid down his life for us, and our Father raised him from the dead. And so we can trust that he is our King, and that when he instructs us and guides us and calls us, his word is true and good and can be followed.